This is a video about mistakes. I did my first game jam, and I had to make a lot of decisions. And I also made maybe a few mistakes. I thought I'd share what I learned along the way. It was a pretty interesting process because honestly, I was tired the whole time. I've never had to make things under this much time pressure, and we didn't exactly have a clear game plan from the start. I was in charge of documenting plans and making most of the systems. Mio was in charge of writing the world generation algorithm, and Noel was in charge of art and sound and also did most of the design decisions. Though his decisions were filtered through me and Mio, as we were the ones that had to program it. Noel had seen this cool world generation algorithm that he wanted to use in a game called Wave Function Collapse. The simplified explanation is that it had a bunch of tile types that have rules about what tiles they can be adjacent to. It takes a map, either empty or with some tiles already in it, and starts placing tiles using their adjacency rules. Now, that's not a game idea. That's just a cool world gen algorithm. And my job was to make the features and systems work for this game that didn't even know what genre it was trying to be yet. Thankfully, I was given reins to document our plans, and Noel was eager to talk about his ideas. Mio went off to code the world gen. So we sat down and hashed out exactly what the player was doing in this game. Looking at my notes, I'm pretty sure Noel had started talking about types of tiles and what you do with those tiles, and I had to take those words and turn them into, okay, so tiles need to be interacted with, they need to know what happens when they're interacted with, they probably need some prerequisite for being interacted with. I guess that's a script. Also, you need to know what tile you're interacting with, but that's more a case of knowing where the player character is, and so on. Now you have an idea of the kind of information and instructions we're working with, we can take a look at what I actually had to make. 1. We need an inventory. How do I do an inventory? Well, I need items, so I can make an item resource to hold the data I need. Then I guess the player has an inventory that holds all the items they have, and I'll just have all the item resources stored in there. Wait a minute. This is a game jam game. There's only ever going to be one inventory. I don't need to keep track of how many items there are in that inventory. I can just add an item amount variable in the item resource itself and increment that when the player gains or loses that item. The data's shared globally, so it should work better here for convenience sake. This is an example of how I scoped for complexity. At first I considered a much more complicated option, making some kind of inventory component to give to the player, but I quickly realized that the scope of the game was way smaller than this level of complexity. I've got less than 2 weeks, and I'm tired like all the time, so I really don't want to be spending my time building a fancy inventory system that will go totally unused. Adjusting how complicated and flexible I made things quickly became the recurring theme of this game jam, as all of my game dev experience so far has been on bigger projects. And also, I don't even know what the game is going to be. If I overshoot, I waste time and energy on features that are literally unused. And if I undershoot, I lose time and energy later when I have to expand on a feature in a direction that will instantly introduce bugs. Okay, back to the game. 2, we need tiles. How are we doing tiles? I guess it's a tile map. Quickly check with Mio, is he making his algorithm work for tile maps? I guess it doesn't matter, I can just adapt whatever I'm doing for whatever we use, but it probably is tile maps. Mio tells me about this neat feature that lets you add custom data to tiles in a tile set. It's a lot like giving them variables, so I could allow tiles to have a name variable and set their names by hand in the tile set. 10 minutes of working with this later, I mildly flabbergasted Mio by setting one of these data types to object and giving them a resource. This way we can store all of the tile data in a more reasonable place than a tile set. Hooray for teamwork! I didn't immediately move the data into a tile data resource though, because I didn't know how much data I would actually be storing in those tiles. I did end up making the switch the next day though, once I saw how many tile types we might have. 3. Movement. So with movement, I ended up being pretty close with my initial scoping. once we decided movement would be restricted to the grid, it became pretty easy to plan for. I tracked the grid position of the character in a vector 2i that would only be incremented by 1 or -1 in whatever direction the player was moving. I then had a pixel distance integer, which just represented the number of pixels in a tile. The grid position is multiplied by the pixel distance value to get the actual position of the player, plus an offset vector to center the sprite into the middle of the tile. I don't think I was thinking about scoping correctly here. I think I was just working on reflex. Seeing a raw number in an equation like this tends to feel really wrong to me, as it would be totally unreadable to anyone returning to read this themselves. It did pay off almost immediately when Null handed me 16 by 16 tiles to replace 8 by 8 tiles 2 days later though. Also, I added a facing direction variable, which tracked which direction the player was facing, because I thought it might be useful later. This was a good call. 4. Interaction. So in my tile data resource, I added an interaction behavior variable to store the logic for interactions. I made it a script at first, but knew that later it would just become a resource anyway, as it would be easier to store all interaction data there for readability. I think there's a better way to make this, but again, game jam, scoping, time pressure. Now that I had my tile types and movement, I wrote an interact function that took the player's grid position and facing direction to get the position of the tile, used the position to get the tile data resource from that tile from the tile set, and then called interaction behavior.interact on it. One of the things that ended up bugging me about this project was that I had to write these extremely verbose, repetitive lines of code every time I wanted any data from a position of a tile on the tile map. Like, oh god, so many times. At this point of the day, I was getting pretty tired, so I just wrote a little function that turned grassy trees into regular grass. I did it by switching the tile set position to 3 higher on the tile set. And now this is a ridiculous way of making this work, but 1, I didn't know what the project would look like later, and 2, I remember feeling dizzy and wanting to make it work as quickly as possible so I could test how it felt to play. I think this is the first example of me doing something a little bit silly because I decided I wanted to have a feature done, and just slightly overworking myself at that point was an acceptable price to pay. So I want to pause and examine what exactly I've done here. The data for tiles is handled in 2 ways. One is that the data is the same for all tiles of a specific type. Grass, for example, will always be uninteractable, and you can walk through it. But only one of these grass tiles is a northwest edge. And that information is tile specific. That way, I can manage the appropriate data separately and minimize the amount of repeated data entry I might have to do. Still ended up having to do a decent amount of data entry. And stop the clock. Here's a question. Did I undershoot or overshoot in my scoping? I underscoped. If I took time to pause, took a break, thought about what this might actually need to look like, I would have realized that I want to separate the background and foreground layers right here. On top of that, I might have realized that I needed to consider the order of operations for how tiles would be interacted with. For example, I hadn't considered if it would be better to interact with the foreground first or the background. I'm going to be adding bridge tiles in a second, which requires interacting with water in the background, but breaking trees involves interacting with the foreground. A tree is never going to be on water, but other objects we add later on might be. I didn't consider any of this, even when I later separate the background and foreground layers. This, in my opinion, is a mix of my fatigue after quickly hashing out 3 other features and my inability to predict the future of where we were going with the project. Alternatively, if I had experienced making this kind of system before, I'm certain I would have had the foresight to avoid these problems. You're going to see how, in my rush to have a functioning project, these kinds of oversights come back to bite me real fast. had a half day here. I just added an interaction result variable to the tile set that let each tile know what it turned into when interacted with. I think this is the first example of me thinking I'm being clever, making a system that will make my life easier later, when in reality every single one of these tiles is going to need to manually have chosen a tile to turn into if it can be interacted with. Also, I separated the layers into background and foreground, did the data entry for new tiles, all of that stuff. Alright, I had a half day again. I made these destruction waves that go across the screen and void tiles in their path, which allows the world to regenerate anew. There weren't any significant problems with this part of the project, because when we were talking about the waves, we couldn't really make up our mind on how quickly the world should regenerate behind them. So I kind of planned for the code to be changeable later. I was of the opinion that they should have short tails, only like 4 or 5 tiles long, but it turned out the world regenerated too quickly behind them, which meant the islands didn't actually change at all. I weirdly enjoyed being totally wrong here, because I had taken a backseat on the design choices, and we had ended up passing on some of my ideas, which meant I didn't get to see if I was right or wrong. It gets way too easy to sit around coding and being snarky, but it's nice to say something with your whole chest, and then be reminded that sometimes you're the idiot monkey and that you're working with people who can see things you can't see. I'm staring into space, sitting in a car on the way to an Easter gathering with friends. I open my Discord. I spend 5 minutes thinking about how the hell this fits in with what we currently have. Then I give up and stop thinking about it. Okay, so, stairs. It's similar to bridges, right? You normally can't walk onto water, you normally can't walk up cliffs. So, I can use the same blocked movement logic as my bridges, right? Wrong! You can sometimes walk onto cliffs if you're already on a cliff. Pretending that they're water is wrong. I think it's at this point I just start accepting that it's way easier to add a new variable to check for whatever new exception to the rule I need. Even if it's messier, it's quicker, we're only here for another 7 days, and if I'm coming back to change this again, it's almost certainly for yet another exception to the rule. I add an elevation layer integer, and if you're walking to or from a different height, I check for stairs, and in the tile set, for my stairs I added an allowed movement variable for whatever direction they allow you to cross. Works like a dream. Okay, what else did I do on day 7? Oh yeah. So, there's a quality of life change that we discussed for a little bit. Currently, when you pick up resources, you have to interact with them. AKA, hit the spacebar. For all of these trees. The world gen has been working for, what, 2 days? And we're already tired of hitting spacebar. It's time to add auto pickup on move. And by it's time, I mean I didn't plan for this and I'm gonna have to add to the movement code. It's just adding, right? Well, when you move towards something, we check what it is, right? So I can also check if that tile can be interacted with by calling interact on it at the same time. Except now I've returned false when something can be picked up, which means that you can now walk onto water if there's a stone on it. Well, not great. I guess if the problem is that we're returning false when there's something to pick up, then we could just have it return true and check the tile again. Now, this does work. It works as intended. It's also incredibly stupid. It looks stupid. It hides the fact that something is being interacted with. I'm fairly certain the programming principle being violated here is called pure functions, though I think of it as separation of responsibility, or not separating responsibility in this circumstance. This is my favorite example of things I did because I was tired and moving quickly. I made a funny mistake, and I've been making mistakes in the code since day one, and honestly, I don't disagree with my decision to not fix this, because it's still more important to have it functional, so that we can test how it plays. It's a small prototype, we have 2 weeks, and I'm consistently mentally at about 50%. All I did today was add tails to the destruction waves, so that they wouldn't instantly regenerate. Seems like I took the rest of the day off because I was feeling dizzy. That being said, the next day, Noel sent images of the tier 2 tiles that you convert islands into, and I know that only happened after we sat down for a discussion on the gameplay mechanics. Which means despite my fatigue, I was still making time to have a focused discussion on game design. I honestly think I only have myself to blame for how much I tired myself out during this game jam. Okay, so I spent the day writing a flood fill algorithm that would get the positions of all the tiles on an island into an array so they could be converted into sky tiles. This was one of the first things I had learned when learning to code and used back when I had to make my procedural generation map, so I was pretty excited to get to use it. Implementing the code within the larger project wasn't a problem at all, because I had successfully predicted that we would need a slot in the interaction resources for custom behavior. I did screw the flood fill algorithm up a couple times though, so it took me all the time I had, and still needed bug fixing the next day. Also, I wrote a tool in Godot for the first time. I think this was one of the only new things I tried my hand at during this project, and I was pleasantly surprised that my first attempt worked after a little bug fixing. The problem I had was that the tiles in the tile set had to know what they were going to turn into, but the northwest corner of grass has to know that it's going to turn into a northwest corner of cloud, so I can't just tell it to turn into a cloud. So each tile on the tile set needs another variable that represents what it will turn into. However, I really don't want to just give it the vector position of the tile it turns into, because I know that if there are any changes whatsoever, I could end up doing a bunch of really annoying data entry. So I separate it into 2 parts. The tile data resource that the tile turns into, and what edge tile the tile is. We already technically had a bunch of edge types listed in the wave function collapse script, so I just followed the naming scheme set here. Yes, I still had to do the data entry for all these tiles, but it meant that the whole thing was a lot more flexible if we wanted grass to turn into a tile type that wasn't clouds. So, all the tiles had the resource of the tile that they would turn into, so I needed a way to match those edge types together. I wrote a tool that takes a tile set and resource and scans the entire tile set for tiles whose tile resource matches the tool's tile resource. And in the tile resource, I created a dictionary called Tile Atlas Positions, where each edge type would store an array of the vector positions of that edge type on the tile set. I stored them in an array because some tiles have duplicate edge types, like the sky tiles, which replace water with one of 8 different types. Now all I have to do to change what tile type a tile is converted into is to just drag the tile resource into its conversion result variable in the editor. I'm pretty pleased with how this turned out amidst the chaos of the rest of the project. Okay, let's talk about Omni bridges. Noel and Mio had let me know that they really wanted Omni bridges in the game. What's an Omni bridge? When you place a bridge, it's directional, left to right or top to bottom. This can be annoying, because sometimes you want to turn in the middle of the ocean. Need an Omni bridge, a bridge in all directions. So I write code that turns a bridge into an Omni bridge when you interact with it. Now you're on a bridge, you want to turn, you face the side of the bridge, and press interact. Question. Following our interaction logic, which you obviously remember, what happens? 1. Bridge becomes Omni bridge. 2. bridge gets placed on the tile we are facing. It's number 2. Where is the logic that decides what tile we're interacting with? In the character script. Oh no. The cool, flexible part of the code where my custom OmniBridge code happens is here. The hastily made, highly inflexible part of the code where the position of the interaction is decided is here. Well, I guess we could refactor the positioning code. Bug time! You added an order to check tiles to see if they're interactable, except you started with the facing position first, so it never checks your own tile. Bug time! You made the interact script always interact with the tile you're standing on first, which means you can only build Omni bridges. Bug time! You can't place a wood bridge if you're standing on a stone bridge with no stone, despite having wood to place the wood bridge with. Bug time! You can't interact with trees. Bug time! You can't place bridges at all. So, I'm tired. It's like 10 PM. I've been dragging the chalk of my brain against the blackboard of poorly planned code architecture for 3 or so hours. I get it working. In the end, I managed to barely get around the problem by checking a specific order of tiles first, and then in the place bridge script, writing a second check for valid tiles. The only way I can get it working without introducing new bugs is by writing redundant code. And I'm okay with it, because it means I can go to bed. Rushing my game jam code made me more frustrated than I have been in a very long time. Like, I couldn't tell you the last time I had to go vent to a friend because I was having an awful time trying to make code do what I wanted it to. This really killed my motivation to keep working on the project. After this, I was just desperate for everything we did to be extremely simple. Thankfully, I still had the capacity to go to the team and let them know that I had no energy to do anything complicated anymore, and we did not have the time to really start throwing out new ideas to be created, so whatever we had at that point was going to be 95% of our final project. I spent most of the day playing a JRPG. I'm not kidding. After 2 weeks of focusing on the project, dealing with sudden changes, resting for the specific purpose of being able to focus on implementing features, my brain was so fried and needed an indeterminate amount of time to do literally anything else. I think if I was working alone, I would not have done any more work on the project, nor even submitted it. Thankfully, I still felt like hanging out with Noel and Mir, and I feel like because of my message about being short on time, something changed. When I hopped on the Discord, the vibes were way less stressed and way more chill, and Noel basically handed me this very concise list of specific changes, and I kind of just no thoughts, head empty blitzed through this entire list with almost no further psychic damage to myself. I think this part also went way faster because it was entirely within the scope of what I had created. The structure for points 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 8 were literally already implemented by me on my first day of coding. I was metaphorically kissing past me on the mouth in gratitude. We already had 2 bridge types, so a third was pretty easy to implement. The wave bug fixing was a little tricky, but all the other points going so quickly and easily was incredibly motivating, and I basically just settled into a low energy cruising mental state for the rest of the project. The rest of the time I spent was bug fixing and chilling out with the squad. A funny thing happened here where I had to fix some off-by-1 errors with the destruction waves, many of which occurred because I had no idea how the borders of the map were positioned, and then I had to fix some off-by-1 errors for the wave indicators. Both the wave indicators and the map borders were made by Mio, and my unfamiliarity with how it worked meant it was basically destined to be buggy. Then Mio had to go and add a function to the movement that let you hold down a button to keep moving. Which is to say, on the second last day, at like 10 PM in the evening, both Mio and I were tooling around in each other's code making changes. I didn't do anything on day 14. There was a bug that Mio fixed in 3 minutes, But apart from that, we were all incredibly exhausted and done trying. I felt it was pretty important to end on a good note so that we'd actually want to work together in the future. So while we chilled out, I sent it to lots of people I knew and we sat in Discord and reflected on what we'd made together and how it felt. Mio told me my code was a mess and I just responded, I know. If we were to keep working on this, I would rewrite the whole code base to be clean first. Noel told me he was sorry for not having a clearer idea of what the game needed to be at first, but we both kind of knew it's hard to know what a game needs to be until you've made more of it. And also, I told him that next time I'd like to try taking a bigger lead in the design direction of the game. Pretty sure that won't be for a while though. I've got a couple personal projects in the works. So, the game jam is done. Let's review the mistakes I made and how I can learn from them. 1. Pacing. I overworked myself. Every time I sat down, I was pushing myself to get as much done as possible. I'm pretty sure if I had just chilled out a bit more, I would have gotten more done. I'm a lot better at pacing myself long term, but the 2-week deadline made me exhaust myself in week 1 and crawl across the line in week 2. 2. Dependency. Everything I made that was intended to be temporary became permanent as soon as I moved on. Everything I made that was intended to be permanent became a nightmare to bug fix. If it's temporary, I've actually thought about how it might need to change. If it's permanent, then I'm assuming it'll never change, and when it does need to be changed, I'm then stuck in the torment nexus. It's a prototype for a game jam. I should be building everything with the knowledge that it's temporary and could get torn down at any point. Building on that last point, 3. Scoping. I talked about scoping just a little bit in this video, but on reflection, I think I would much rather underscope than overscope. When you're building a prototype, it's almost impossible to predict how things will change. And it just seems way easier to build things for whatever mechanics and systems you need now, and if they need to be changed later, you're not as attached to tearing them down and rebuilding them because you didn't spend an excess amount of time getting attached to the idea. Alright, I hope you learned something and I didn't just spout a bunch of bullshit. Peace.